Hi everyone, so my group and I are going to be doing our presentation over the Fort Pillow Massacre. The Fort Pillow Massacre took place in Tennessee on April 12, 1864. The generals and commanders for this battle were Lionel F. Booth for the Union and Nathan Bedford Forrest for the Confederate. Fort Pillow was constructed and abandoned by the Confederate Union on May 1862. The construction was directed by the General Gideon Pillow, which is how the fort got its name. A little bit more about the fort. Of course, the first who lived there were the Confederates, but they had a specific way to design it for their safety. The fort was approximately 6 to 8 feet high and was designed to be a 125 semicircle with 3 lines for defense. The way those 3 lines for defense were used for safety were because around the fort there was a barricade around it. Around that there was another which made 2. Around the second there was a third. The location they chose to build the fort was on the east bank of the Mississippi River, which was 40 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. If you would like to know more about the Fort Pillow Massacre, please keep watching.
Let's dive into Major General Nathan Bradford Forrest for the Confederate. He is a native to Tennessee, born in 1821. Although he spent most of his time in Mississippi, he always thought of Tennessee as his real home. He's back now, and he wasn't happy with the way his home looked. Crops and barns were burnt to the ground all throughout his beloved home. Apparently, renegade Tennesseans, led by Colonel Fielding Hurst, had been plundering all over southwestern Tennessee. He had been charging people a large sum of money in return for not burning their stuff to the ground. Even worse was how he treated some of Forrest's men. He apparently tortured them, even one instance where he had decapitated a Lieutenant Willis Dodds in his own family's home. Residents warned Forrest about a nest of outlaws who had held themselves up in Fort Pillow, just 40 miles north of Memphis. Unfortunately, he was under orders to refit a new division in Kentucky, but he promised that he'd take care of the Fort Pillow in a day or 2. He then issued a proclamation labeling Hurst and all his troops as outlaws and should be killed. They weren't fit to be prisoners of war. After a few battles later, Forrest turned his attention to Fort Pillow.
The year was 1864. On April 12th, when the horrific tragedy struck, Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, deemed the Wizard of the Saddle, led the most successful raids to conquer territory and purloin his enemy's supplies, as well as capturing opposing soldiers and keeping them captive. Prior to the massacre, Forrest was claiming his chunk of Kentucky, but as he turned back around to Tennessee, he recognized more was to be achieved, and thus he had his eye on a fort, abandoned by Confederates long ago but now ran by some hundreds of Union troops. This fort was Fort Pillow. Stationed on a high escarpment alongside the eastern bank of the Mississippi, Forrest reported on April 4th, "There is a federal force of 500 or 600 at Fort Pillow, which I shall attend to in a day or 2, as they have horses and supplies which we need." End quote. Stationed with his Union troops, Major Lionel E. Booth, a veteran of the regular army, was overall commander of the Union forces. He fell under Major Bradford, who had been quartering at Fort Pillow for the past few months while recruiting new members and allegedly terrorizing Confederate sympathizers in the vicinity. Booth, either very confident or rather very careless, assured Major General Stephen Hurlburt in Memphis, "I think it's perfectly safe." Although there were numerous reported sightings of Forrest and his men nearly 30 or 40 miles around Fort Pillow. On the afternoon of April 11th, Forrest met with fellow Confederate Major General Chalmers at Brownsville, 38 miles east of Fort Pillow. Chalmers led the first Confederate troops to engage the fort. His men secured the higher ground of the middle line of the trenches from which sharpshooters could take fire towards the interior works. Union Lieutenant Mac J. Leeming had noted, "The defenders suffered pretty severely in the loss of commissioned officers by the unerring aim of the rebel sharpshooters." Among the first to fall, impacted and fatally wounded with a rifle bullet in the chest, Major Booth, who had been wandering incautiously between the fort's two battery parts. Booth's death at 9 a.m. left the fort under command of the comparatively inexperienced Bradford. Immediately acquainting himself with the terrain features, Forrest arrived at 10 a.m. He picked a spot he felt could give him the upper hand, unknowingly leaving himself exposed to the Union fire. He had to readjust, suffering bruises from a nasty fall. Ignoring the advice given to him that he'd be better off on foot, Forrest lost 2 horses in the course of the day's fighting. With his keen eyes, he was able to identify a row of barracks that would give his forces an advantage. Located just outside the interior works, it was perfect and worked for the advances towards the inner quarter. Leeming reported, "From those barracks the enemy kept up a murderous fire on our men despite all our efforts to dislodge him." Forrest realized he could move his troops through the ravines toward the landing below the fort, cutting the garrison off from potential relief or escape. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, Confederates invested the fort. By 3:30 p.m., Forrest decided he could storm the position but chose not to due to the fact he didn't want to lose any more of his soldiers. He noted in a message to the fort's commander, "The conduct of the officers and men garrisoning Fort Pillow has been such as to entitle them to being treated as prisoners of war." He stated that if his demand is to be refused, he couldn't be to blame for the fate of the Union's command. Bradford attempted to buy time to explore his options. Responding under Booth's name, he requested an hour to confer with his officers. Forrest worried the delay might complicate matters for the Confederates if more Union vessels arrived on the river and reduced the time to 20 minutes. Each side began to complain that the other had taken steps during the negotiations that constituted a breach of the truce. Finally, Forrest, who had grown tired of waiting for the Union commander to reach a decision, demanded, in plain and unmistakable English, will he fight or surrender? "We will not surrender," Bradford responded bluntly. Forrest knew his only options. He would have to fight to secure the fort along with its resources. The Confederates signaled for the last attack. They stormed the fort and broke defenses. What happened next would lead to charges against Forrest and his troops that have smoldered for 150 years. Amongst the chaos and panic of the pursuing troops, any of all sense of order was diminished and ceased to exist below the bluff. Many tried to surrender. Some tried to escape through the water and others still continued to resist. Forrest wrote in his report, "The victory was complete, and the loss of the enemy will never be known from the fact that large numbers ran into the river and were shot or drowned. The river was dyed with blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. Although he overestimated the Union garrison at 700, Forrest thought some 500 of these perished." He continued in his report with, "It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with the Southerners." Historians John Kemprich and Robert C. Mainford Jr. set the deaths or mortal wounds among the garrison at between 277 and 297, or 47 to 49% of the total, ranging from 585 to 605 men. Among white units, 31 to 34% were killed, but 64% of the black units died. The toll for the attacking Confederates rested at only 14 killed and 86 wounded. The stunning toll among black troops and allegations by survivors of the killing spree by rebel soldiers prompted the United States government to take special interest in the events at Fort Pillow.
As we can all conclude, Fort Pillow Massacre was very eventful according to history. In fact, it was one of the worst events in record of Confederate troops during the Civil War. The dispute over the significance and memory of the massacre began immediately. It made many people reflect the racial figures of the Civil War itself. The massacre was widely reported in the North, which led to the Union understandably outrage, which led on immediate sponsored investigations and congressional committees to determine what happened and to evaluate a blame. Confederates, meanwhile, vowed that no massacre had taken place. They were certain that the deaths had occurred in combat circumstances. The Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee on April 12, 1864, was one of the most controversial events in the American Civil War. 300 African American Union soldiers surrendered to the Confederate forces and should have been taken as prisoners of war. But on the other hand, the soldiers were all killed. The Confederate refusal to treat these troops as traditional prisoners of war infuriated the North and led to the Union's refusal to participate in prisoner exchanges. Still, the debate and the immediate aftermath engendered one positive outcome. The Fort Pillow Massacre not only encouraged racial violence, but condoned the uproar from the North and denials of the South, which led to leaders from both sides to admit that a massacre motivated by facial antagonism was wrong, or at least should not have occurred. The location where the massacre happened is now a 1,642-acre well-preserved state park that's been open to the community since 1971. The park not only includes cultural and historic heritage, but it also includes 80 outdoor adventures. And this concludes our presentation of the Fort Pillow Massacre.